Hey, everybody. This is Kate from the Your Courageous Life podcast. Today, you can probably tell by the sound quality that I'm recording under very different circumstances than I usually am. Typically, the Your Courageous Life podcast is recorded in batches, and I have great fun coming up with the topics and even responding to questions that you guys bring to me, email us with, and usually I am recording the podcast from a home office, and I have a good mic and headset and no background noise and all that stuff. But I don't have that today. I have moved from California to Texas, and I'll tell the story of all of that at another time. And the reason that I'm coming in here today with no intro and no good mic and recording a podcast anyway is because it's so important. It's so important to record this podcast today that it simply cannot wait. It just cannot. Because in the weeks since I moved to a new state, and we've all been grappling with a pandemic, as more and more and more stories of people who belong to marginalized communities, particularly people of color, Black people, as more and more of those stories hit the news, it's like, yes, we have to have the courage to speak up. And that is what today's podcast episode is about. Imperfect though it might be in sound quality, it is imperative upon all of us that we are speaking up. So I'm going to talk about why so often people don't speak up, because you might understand this. You might be like, I want to speak up, but here's why I don't. I'm going to talk about why we need to speak up. And I'm going to offer some thoughts on how to navigate the fear that can come up for people around speaking up. I would like to let people know in advance that while I will be referring to the death of George Floyd, and while I will be referring to the violence that marginalized communities have been experiencing for so long, I will not be going into nitty-gritty detail. I feel like that is a trigger warning worth offering. There is not a detailed graphic discussion of any of that in this podcast episode. I also want to say too that I am speaking out because I feel that that is what integrity must do. And at the same time, my primary commitment is to elevating the voices of people of color. And people who are part of marginalized communities. So friends of mine who belong to the LGBTQIA community, friends of mine who have experienced gender discrimination, family members of mine who are Black, who have experienced racism, friends of mine who are witnessing some pretty terrible things. I'm really more interested not in being another white person who is saying, here's what I think. I'm more interested in being a white person who stands with and beside those who are bearing the brunt of this. And frankly, we're all bearing the brunt of it. You might be listening to this as a white person and think, racism only affects people of color. No, it affects you too. And I don't just mean the air quotes inconvenience of it when it hits the news cycle. I mean, if you actually do some soul searching, racism affects you and your children. It affects your heart. It affects your integrity. You cannot look at the world as a person of integrity and see what is going on and then think that doesn't affect me and still be in integrity. And that's what I'm going to get into today. So my aim beyond this podcast episode is actually not for me to be doing more talking. It's to elevate the voices of others who need more visibility. So this will be one of the few things I personally will be saying about these things. The rest of what I'm going to be doing online and have been doing online has been, how do I elevate the voices of others? So first, why is it so often that people don't speak up? And in this episode, I'm primarily going to be focusing on people who have privilege in some area. And we have multiple intersections. So even though I present as white and I have privilege in terms of being a white person when it comes to race, I have less privilege at being someone who is a woman when it comes to sexism. So there are certain places where you might have privilege and certain places where you might not. If you are poor, for instance, but you are white, then you might be able to have some level of privilege around white skin, but if you don't have money coming in, you have less privilege there. People have different privileges around being differently abled. People have different privileges around mental health, around education. And I will be offering some resources for learning more about all of this in this episode. So why is it that so often people who have privilege don't speak up? Well, here's what I hear, and I've experienced as well. People are afraid of saying the wrong thing and causing offense. People are afraid of saying the wrong thing and causing harm. People are afraid of looking stupid. Like maybe they'll say something and they might say it in such a way that actually their information is wrong or something like that. I've met a number of people who feel like until they know every single nuance of every single piece of the issue they're about to speak out on, they don't feel like they're qualified to speak out on it because they're afraid of looking stupid. They're afraid that somebody's going to point out one little wrinkle in their argument and then they will feel/look stupid. That's the fear. And then there's a fear of receiving criticism. And I really have to say too that for a lot of people who have family members or who belong to communities that believe very differently about what's going on than they do, yeah, like people don't want to be cast out of the group. But here's why we need to speak up. Because when we are in a place of having some level of privilege and power, we are in such less danger than somebody who is a marginalized person. And I'll give an example of what that can look like. My best friend, Valerie, is a Black woman. And she and I have had a number of very open conversations about race over the years. And I remember one time having dinner with her, and we were talking, and she told me about going into a store, and she's had this happen multiple times, going into stores and being followed around by security, and having security stop her as she was about to leave the store and say, "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to search your bag." And when she said that to me at dinner, without even thinking, I start going, oh, I would like to see someone do that with me. I would be like, no, you're going to need a search warrant to see my bag. You need to back up off of me. You do not get to see my bag. And I don't know why you've been following me around at the store like a creeper. Well, Valerie looks at me and she goes, oh, no. Oh, no. As a Black woman, I cannot do that. And suddenly I got it. That's privilege. The fact that I have been conditioned as a white person my entire life to not take shit. And this doesn't mean all white people are conditioned this way, but I certainly got more of that than my best friend, who's a Black woman, got. Because as she began to explain to me in her grace, educating me instead of rolling her eyes at me because I don't get it or didn't at that time, if she were to fight back, she would probably be arrested. She could possibly be in physical harm. She would be stereotyped as a, quote, angry Black woman, which is just awful, for speaking up for her rights, her right to walk through a store. and not have her bag searched on the way out. If she speaks up, she is in greater threat to her physical safety than I am. That is why those of us with privilege need to speak up, because there are people who are being harmed, who need help, and they don't need us. They, as in people who are being harmed, do not need anyone speaking up for them, as in subverting over their words, busting in there, going, I am the white savior, or I am the person who's going to fix it. And I think that any time that we are wondering how to show up, if we would just take a moment, if all of us would just take a moment to think about the places where we have those intersections, where we have less power, we can get a lot of insight into how we want to be treated. Because while my privilege is around white skin, if I think of sexism, and if I think of how I would want to be treated if a man said, hey, I'll be an ally, but then he came in and was speaking over me and was trying to speak for me and was trying to take over the conversation, well, I wouldn't like that. So that gives me some insight into how I might want to approach these issues with sensitivity. We need to speak up, though, because integrity is not just for you. Courage is not just for you. And if you listen carefully to the podcast episodes I've recorded, if you look at the blog posts that I've been writing all these years, I think courage and integrity start with you, but they are not just for you. You cannot call yourself someone who has integrity, but then cherry pick when you practice it. I'm going to say that again. You cannot call yourself someone who has integrity and then cherry pick when you practice it. You cannot just be someone who go, oh, I have integrity. But then like, oh, well, this issue over here, I'm not going to do anything for those people who are suffering over there, even though I see it. It doesn't work that way. Integrity and courage and other virtues are not performative. They are a way of being. And at first they might feel performative because you feel afraid to step out there and actually live it. But ultimately, these virtues are part of who you become when you practice them. If you look at the Courageous Living program, you will see that I have a number of interviews there. And one of the interviews that I brought on a couple years ago was an incredible person named Andrea Renee Johnson. And I asked her to speak to me for the Courageous Living program because I wanted her to speak to the fact that the courage that we practice in our personal lives has to have a ripple effect out into the world. I mean, if you're truly practicing courage as a way of being, it will not just stop with you, because the world does not just stop with you. And we have to think about that. So, how do we come into community with our courage? Well, first of all, we acknowledge that there is a problem there. This is very similar when we're afraid and we're trying to deal with fear in the old ways of ignoring, placating, and attacking. It doesn't work. We have to see that there is a connection here. So I'm going to speak to community and some of the things that I have seen, because one of the problems we're facing right now, I believe, in the world is that people don't actually believe this is still a problem. So I'll just speak first to racism. I have a black stepfather. I'm here to tell you, racism is real, alive, and still happens. I am here to tell you that. I'm not a liar. I'm not somebody misunderstanding the facts. I am here to tell you. I mean, we're talking little things. Here's an example of what it is like to be a black person in America as reported by my stepfather. One year, he rakes up all the leaves in the yard, and he lived at that time on the edges of a city with my mother. So he rakes up all the leaves in the yard, and he didn't have like a leaf cruncher thingy or whatever, and he there's a nearby field of farmland, and he took the bags of leaves out to the farmland and just kind of let the leaves go in the wind on the farmland. It wasn't trash. Cop rolls by, tickets him. For leaves, you guys. For leaves. And of course, I mean, when he comes home and he tells a story like that, it's fear in our hearts that, like, oh my God, because that could have been something worse. You alone out on a secluded area where a cop arrives as a black man in America. Okay? My best friend, I've mentioned, she's black. And let me tell you something. Leadership matters, because she has been telling me more stories about racial slurs directed at her, screamed at her, since Trump was elected. He does incite violence. He does embolden his supporters to violence. And if you are listening to this and you are a Trump supporter and you think that it's just a vote, I'm here to tell you you're wrong. It's not just a vote. The racism may have always been there, but you need to know that in subtle ways, he is absolutely encouraging racial violence. And he always does it in a way where if you technically pin him down on his words, he can go, what? I didn't do that. I didn't mean that. I was being sarcastic. It's just a joke. And it's just, people are being harmed. It is not just a vote. I have a sibling who is transgender. And he has also shared with me increasing reports of this kind of violence. And for those of you who may feel, I want to do something about what's going on, but when it breaks over into when the anger and frustration become looting and rioting, that's where I draw the line. That's where I draw the line. Please, looting, rioting, they're never ideal, but please understand that it is happening because people are not being heard any other way. How many games did Colin Kaepernick take a knee and nothing changed? That is a peaceful protest, and nothing changed. George Floyd was arrested faster for an alleged misdemeanor crime than was the white police officer who had his knee on Floyd's neck, who killed him. I beg of you to please not hide out behind it's just a vote, because it's not just a vote. It's a system. And you one person listening to this won't change the system by changing how you vote, but all of us together can affect change. People are being killed here. And you don't have to become a scholar on race relations, inclusion, diversity. You don't have to know everything. But we do need you to be willing to start speaking up and take action. So I'm going to bring this back to courage. When we feel afraid, we often do one of three things. I talk about this in the Courage Habit. We ignore, we placate, we attack. And I'm seeing some really well-meaning people who I'm sure don't agree with what's going on do these things. And here's how it can show up. Ignoring the problem, pretty obvious, hoping someone else will fix it. Or thinking that you're outside of it. Placating the problem would be those who show up to try to start speaking out, but they're really, really into either taking over the conversation. They don't mean to, but that's what happens, centering themselves in what they think and what they think should be done, or trying to do it right when they speak up and getting so into trying to do it right that if there's any feedback, hey, you were centering yourself here, hey, you weren't thinking about XYZ variable when you posted that on your Facebook wall, then going completely the opposite direction. Well, look at that. I tried to speak out. I couldn't do it right, so I shouldn't speak out at all, or I couldn't do it right. people should just be grateful that I spoke out at all. It's a mess. Everybody complains. I don't want to be part of this anymore. And then the other thing that happens is people attack. And that's when they go online and they unleash their fury. And then again, it can come across as centering your own experience instead of being a stand for change, and or the message gets lost. So ignoring, placating, and attacking. Here's what I would ask. Here's what we could consider. How about those of us who have a privileged intersection, whatever that might be for you? Ask that you first access the body. I'll share for me that one of the things I'm working on doing is really trying to actively vent out my own frustration, pain, rage, all of it on my own, because I don't want to get into a situation where somehow that comes out and then it shows up as fragility and me crying, and then maybe somebody from a marginalized community is feeling bad, like they need to like comfort me. I don't want that for them. I also am wanting to access the body so that I can stay grounded in my personal power and not get pulled into the parasitic undertow of all of the chaos that the world is in. So it's a personal practice as well as one that benefits others. I would also ask that you listen to your stories and reframe them. Notice if you go into those fear patterns. One of the 4 fear patterns that I talk about in the Courage Habit is pessimism. And I see a profound amount of pessimism. Well, the world isn't going to change. Yeah, it will. It has always changed. And it has always changed because people decided they'd had enough and that it was time to change. Well, me speaking out about racism, it's not going to do anything but cause drama. You don't know that. For people who want to fight with you, yeah, that might be drama and you don't have to participate. But for somebody else who needs to know that there is someone out there who cares, it could be everything. Listen to your stories and reframe them. You decide what you're capable of. And these are the moment to moment to moment decisions that we are making. And we are shaping our world in these moment to moment to moment decisions. If you are not going to be with us, the silence can really have an impact. Have you ever been in a room before where someone made a joke at your expense and no one stood up for you? And it felt awkward and weird. Now take that and magnify it times 1,000 for someone whose life could be affected and no one spoke up. Please speak up. You don't have to be saying it perfectly. You don't have to say everything. You don't have to be a scholar on the matter. It is enough to start with. I am here and I am with you. I don't know yet what I can do, but I'm committed to learning what I can do. I'm committed to doing something. And then I would also say, in terms of taking action, seek community. Now, please don't put your learning on the backs of the people who are part of a marginalized group. Please do not go over to a transgender person and ask them to give you an education on what it is like to be transgender and all the different, the checklist of the steps you need to take. Because that person is already dealing with enough. Instead, you can educate yourself. You can find others who are committed to teaching and to learning. I already mentioned Andrea Renee Johnson. I'm also going to say, this is where I get into some resources I've found really helpful. Desiree Attaway Group, her Sister Summer series, I took it last year, really beautiful, profound questions. I would also recommend the book So You Want to Talk About Race. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the name, but I believe I am getting it. Ijeoma Oluo. Ijeoma for the first name. Oluo for the last name. And again, the book is So You Want to Talk About Race. And it literally is, let's take these questions that often, particularly white people have about race, and let me answer them as a mixed race woman. And let me share with you some possible ways you could handle racial situations that come up and be an ally and an advocate. Another great book is Sonia Renee Taylor, The Body is Not an Apology. This is a book that we ask people to read in the Courageous Living Coach certification, because our coaching clients, I'm a coach, so I think this lens is important. I mean, if I'm working with a coaching client with multiple intersections, maybe she is dealing with fat phobia, maybe she is a person of color, maybe she is somebody who is really struggling around something else, maybe how she's being perceived at work as somebody who identifies as a woman. Those things don't stop at the door, right? They go with my client wherever my client goes. It is my responsibility as somebody who empathically cares, who really wants to get the full scope of what my client is living. It is my responsibility to understand more about my client. And so that's why we give The Body is Not an Apology to everybody in CLCC. And we talk about how we relate to those different intersections. It has to start, I will end with saying, it has to start with your willingness. It has to start with your willingness. Here's the thing that I know for myself. The men I have met who have tried to speak out about sexism, every single one of them at some point has said something, without exception, where the thought came through my head, yeah, you're saying that because you're a guy. There's a piece you're missing about what it's like to be a woman here. I have been poor, and I'm talking even by United States standards, poor. There was a period of my childhood where we were food insecure. I grew up in a neighborhood where my physical safety was a regular source of stress. And I have absolutely been in rooms before where well-meaning people have said things assuming that they were being helpful that were, as somebody who has that background, as like, no, they're not getting it. But I will tell you that in any place where I have been allowed by the people who had more privilege, and I've been heard and I've been listened to say, actually, let me correct something about that perspective. Safety was created. If somebody was invested only in doing it right and kind of coming out there and being like, I am the spokesperson for how we da-da-da-da-da, and if they were missing it, that didn't feel safe. But when safety was created for the conversation, I was so appreciative of their willingness to try. I've never looked at anybody who made one of those missteps and thought, God, why did they even bother? We have a responsibility here to not leave people alone. If anything, just think of any life problem you've ever had and think of what it feels like to be alone with that. Think of the greatest pain you've ever walked through: grief, losing someone, a breakup, times when you were just absolutely confused and didn't know who you were or what you were going to do. To be alone in that is the worst thing. So please don't leave people alone in what the world is facing right now. I'm going to again say that in terms of specific steps for taking action, please educate yourself, read the books, get into the communities where the education is being given. It can start with, though, just simply being willing to say, I might do this imperfectly. I don't know quite how to do it, but I will say I do not like seeing the racism, the oppression, the discrimination against people who are transgender, the harm that is happening to women, the ways that poor people, people who are lower income, are being shortchanged on a regular basis, the horrible obscenities and other means of discrimination that are being put on those who have an immigrant status, kids in cages. I am not okay with this. And I'm going to do more. What the doing can look like will be different for everyone. Personally, for me, for quite some time now, it has been a commitment to educating myself. Whenever I see someone saying something on Facebook that I'm just like, this is clearly incorrect information, I'm going to, I do my darndest to be really calm about it, but I'm going to say, actually, here's this other thing that's going on that we need to consider. I and my business have long been donors to multiple organizations. One of the ones that I have been hearing over and over and over again as doing the most good that I've been donating to for a couple of years is Southern Poverty Law Center. Huge organization to donate to, but find one that's local to you, whether it's a food bank or a national one, and donate what you can. Maybe you can donate time. Maybe you can donate resource knowledge. Like maybe that org really needs to know how to set up a system in their business, and you're like a project manager. You've got all the systems info. It doesn't always have to be money if you don't have money, but money, of course, helps. Read books, educate yourself, raise your children with an intersectional lens. Look around. What are the toys that your children are playing with? What are the books that they are reading? Find out what other people in your community need on an individual level. There's so many different ways. And of course, it suddenly occurred to me like, oh yeah, and voting has to be like at the front of the list. Has to be. Because it's not just about presidential elections. Local elections often influence culture, local culture, far more. So this podcast episode, it's all about the courage to speak up. And I get that you are going to feel afraid, and I get that you are going to make mistakes. And how's that like your life? What I want for the world is a courage that grows. It has always been my opinion that we're not practicing courage just for ourselves. It's because it creates a ripple effect of change. And this is one of those times where it might be outside of your comfort zone, but if you want to walk the world with courage and particularly with integrity, if you want to look your own two eyes in the mirror, you cannot just stand idly by. Things have to change on a systemic level, not just an individual level. My hope is that you will take this and you will, within the next hour, do something that will start that ripple effect. Just imagine if 1,000 people listen to this podcast episode today, and within the next hour, 1,000 people decide to do something, order the book that will help them learn, make a statement that they are not okay with what they see happening, something. If you aren't registered to vote, register to vote. Get online and remind yourself, if you don't know already, who are my representatives and where do they stand on these different issues? Call your local police department. Ask them, how are you training your officers? Are you training your officers in ways that diffuse violence? Are your officers wearing body cams? There's so many lists. How can I be an ally? You can look up these lists on Google. What if 1,000 people today listen to this podcast and within the next hour we have 1,000 acts of change? That can be powerful, and you can be part of that. I send you my love. I send you my care. For anybody who is part of a community, a group that has ever been marginalized or oppressed, or that is continuing to receive such abhorrent treatment, please know that I stand with you and beside you, and I'm here. And I might not do it perfectly either, but I will not be silent. I love you. Thank you.